When the civil defense sirens screamed in Morgantown, West Virginia on the morning of Saturday, October 23, 2077, they served to mark the end of the society of the Old World. When those same sirens spun up again 22 years later, they marked the end of the society of the post-war world. I'm the Irresolute Cartographer, and this is the story of Morgantown. We'll start this with an examination of the sites surrounding Morgantown in the Fallout universe and in the real world. We'll then move on to the layout of the town in the Fallout universe and how it compares to the town in the real world. We'll examine the history of Morgantown in the Fallout universe and a brief history of Morgantown in the real world. We'll then close with some of my notes on this content. With that said, let's get started. In the Fallout universe, Morgantown is located at the north end of the eastern part of the forest region that we get to explore in Fallout 76's Appalachia. It sits just south of the heavily polluted Toxic Valley, at the base of the mountainous Savage Divide. To the north-northwest, criminals of all types were locked into the aging Eastern Regional Penitentiary, where explosive collars were used to keep them in line. Just to the north-northeast of Morgantown, Grafton Dam holds back the reservoir of pollution generated by Grafton Steel that's also known as Lake Grafton. Up the mountain to the east, Ingram Mansion, the one-time home of a Nuka-Cola executive, has become a haven for cultists devoted to the Mothman. A short distance further up that mountainside, Monunga Overlook provides sweeping views of the region and the potential of falling victim to a bear attack. East of Morgantown, Monunga Power Plant provides power to the lines running up and down the Savage Divide. Southeast of Morgantown, the daycare for the rich and powerful known as Bolton Greens became home to a group of cannibal raiders in the years after the bombs. South of town, Greg's mine supply was in dire financial straits before the war, as automation made the need for human mining supplies a thing of the past. South-southwest of Morgantown, Arctos Pharma served as the pre-war stomping grounds to the ruthless raider boss David Thorpe. Southwest of town, Robco set up a poorly funded and ill-fated alternative to Vault-Tec's vaults in Golly Mine. West of Morgantown, the Gorge Junkyard accepted waste from across the region. Lastly, Wilson Brothers Auto Repair lies on the road out of town to the west-northwest. Let's now compare the locations of real-world sites that can be found in-game with their locations in-game. Monunga, West Virginia, found in the mountains east of Morgantown in-game, is found approximately 18 miles southwest of Morgantown in the real world. Grafton, West Virginia, found in the Toxic Valley northwest of Morgantown in-game, is just over 20 miles south-southwest of Morgantown in real life. Grafton Dam and the resulting lake, found just north-northeast of town in-game, are representations of the real-world Tigert Dam and Tigert Lake, found just over 22 miles south-southwest of Morgantown. Clarksburg, West Virginia, found in the heart of the Toxic Valley north of Morgantown in-game, lies approximately 32 miles southwest of real-world Morgantown. The tiny tourist town of Helvetia, West Virginia, found south-southwest of the town in-game, sits about 65 miles south-southwest of Morgantown in the real world. The Responders Outpost in Flatwoods, West Virginia, found west-southwest of Morgantown in-game, lies over 72 miles south-southwest of Morgantown in the real world. The formerly Raider-held Sutton, West Virginia, found south-southwest of Morgantown in-game, lies 78 miles south-southwest of the real-world Morgantown. The one-time lakefront town of Summersville, West Virginia, found south of in-game Morgantown, is found nearly 105 miles south-southwest of the real-world Morgantown. The state capital of Charleston, West Virginia, found south-southwest of Morgantown in-game, is about 126 miles southwest of Morgantown in the real world. Eastern Regional Penitentiary, again found north-northwest of Morgantown in-game, is a representation of the real-world West Virginia Penitentiary found 46 miles west-northwest in Moundsville, West Virginia in the real world. With the sites around Morgantown covered, let's cover the layout of the town itself. In the real world, Morgantown rests in the Monongahela River Valley near the mouth of Deckers Creek. Though the metropolitan area is wider spread, the heart of the city lies on the eastern side of the river and is laid out on a grid, with the roads running either parallel or perpendicular to the river. It lies on West Virginia 19 and 119, in between Interstates 68 and 79. In the Fallout universe, Morgantown lies primarily on the eastern bank of the river, although this in-game river is significantly smaller than the real-world Monongahela. Along with this, the in-game river flows to the south, while the real-world Monongahela flows north into Pennsylvania, where it joins with the Allegheny River at Pittsburgh to become the Ohio River. Aside from the river, there are 4 shared features between the cities, the first being the airport. While in-game the airport lies north of the city across the Monongahela, In the real world, the airport is on a hill east of the city. Second, Morgantown High School, the top-rated school in the state in the real world, is also in the game. Third, the university. In the real world, this is West Virginia University, while in the Fallout universe, Vault-Tec purchased WVU in 2031 and converted the home of the Mountaineers into Vault-Tec University. Along with this, while WVU has multiple campuses within Morgantown, VTU appears to be contained to a central campus. That said, those real-world multiple locations are linked via the fourth shared feature, the Morgantown Personal Rapid Transit. While in-game the Morgantown PRT appears to be a monorail system, the real-world PRT is a fairly unique transit system in which the individual cars drive along on tires on elevated highways rather than on any sort of rail system. While, as I mentioned before, the real-world PRT connects the three campuses of WVU in Morgantown, in-game this system links the university to the airport and a couple other stations across the city. Alright, comparisons aside, let's get to the composition of Morgantown in the Fallout universe as it's represented in Fallout 76. Morgantown is host to 57 houses, including frat houses. There are also apartments, shops with apartments above them, camps on the monorail and rooftops, and 2 farms. There are many shops, including 2 pawn shops, a grocery store, a super duper mart, 3 bookstores, a hardware store, a liquor store, a Fallon's department store, a tobacconist, and 3 pharmacies. There are at least 5 businesses that offer services, including 2 barbershops, a Red Rocket gas station, a law office, and Big Al's tattoo parlor. There are at least 6 restaurants, including 2 delicatessens, Graviano's Italian Eatery, and 3 Slocum's Joe's. There are 4 bars, including the Portside Pub, a bar, a tavern, and the Nuka Shine Speakeasy. There are 5 warehouses, a junkyard, the train yard, the train station, Mama Dolce's food processing plant, and the subterranean Fujinia intelligence base. There are camps for the street house and the roof house. We'll cover the houses later. There's Vault-Tec University and Morgantown High School, the citywide Morgantown PRT with 4 stations. There's an unfinished Robco bot stop, 2 banks, 2 post offices, a park and ride, 2 parking garages, 3 bus stops, a water tower, and the Pulowski Preservation Shelter. With the composition of the city covered, let's get into the history of Morgantown in the Fallout universe. In the years before the war, Morgantown was a bustling college town, one of the few areas in Appalachia to show general economic strength. This was thanks to Vault-Tec University drawing in students and their money from all over the country. By 2077, the students and the alumni included the overseer of Vault 76, future responder Dasa Ben-Ami, Calvin Van Lowe, and the children of notable families like Judith Blackwell and Penelope and Liam Hornwright. In the over 4.5 decades since Vault-Tec had purchased WVU, they had altered the curriculum, replacing the liberal arts programs with those that would train vault designers and overseers. The students that took part in these programs, though concentrated in places like Fraternity Row, dwelled across the city. The money they infused into the local economy was welcomed by landlords and business owners, but many natives were finding themselves struggling to make ends meet as the cost of living rose. Student demand drove up the price of everything and led to the construction of many businesses intended to serve their population more directly than the natives of Morgantown. At least one local was fed up with this, wondering aloud how the city could have needed so many Slocum's Joes. Despite the contention between the long-term residents and the students, Morgantown was undoubtedly in a better state than most of the municipalities in Appalachia. The economy was largely service-based, and this, coupled with the money flowing into the university, kept the city safe from the unrest that racked the other cities in the region. These disparities in urban stability would soon be scourged away by nuclear fire. As October 23, 2077 dawned, Morgantown High School was hosting a Halloween party. The occupants of the Pi Kappa Mu frat house were in their usual post-party stupor, the morning after having continued their long tradition of partying every day, in spite of the recently delivered eviction notice. The Etpets of Eta Psi Epsilon Tau were resting, having celebrated the success of the Nuka Shine Speakeasy the night before. Many locals were lounging outside, enjoying the mild October morning. The peace and calm were ended by the sound of the civil defense sirens screaming out across the city. A small military convoy raced into town, with one APC careening out of control through a sound barrier and into a nearby neighborhood. One Jeep drove to the top of the garage attached to the north station of the Morgantown monorail. At 9:47 a.m., the silhouette of the mountains was outlined sharply as if a second sun was ignited in the sky to the east, followed by a second flash in short succession. Clocks across Appalachia abruptly stopped. The ground began to shake violently. Cracks split the earth as the tectonic plates across the globe slipped, rose, and fell, the force of thousands of nuclear and thermonuclear bombs shattering the very surface of the planet. The military attempted to bring some stability into the chaos, blocking the destroyed road north out of town and setting up a shelter at the high school. Another party of soldiers set up a triage center at Morgantown Airport. The soldiers at the central garage found the monorail now powerless and with a broken track unsalvageable. Though the city had been spared a direct strike, black clouds soon appeared on the horizon, bearing radioactive ash that had been the cities of America's industrial heartland. Everyone that could find shelter did so as quickly as possible. The temperatures began to fall as nuclear winter closed in. Once the radiation dropped to non-lethal levels in early 2078, survivors began to emerge. Morgantown Police Chief Mayfield attempted to maintain order, establishing a curfew to prevent looting. In March, this effort resulted in Mayfield's police firing on some of the former students and an attempt to institute martial law. This story filtered back to the provisional government in Charleston, where the other first responder leaders fretted about what to do in this situation. They didn't want to alienate the police, but they didn't want the students fired on either. We don't know what the overall outcome of this event was, but Mayfield isn't mentioned again, so I think it's safe to assume that he quit the city not long after. As for those that remained in Morgantown, they had to find a way to make a life in the ruins. The non-local students of VTU were now stranded many miles from home, in a post-apocalyptic landscape that was not conducive to long-distance travel. The students joined into small groups led by overseer candidates. Over the first year post-apocalypse, through diplomacy, these small groups merged into larger and larger groups until there were just two remaining: the Street House and the Roof House. These two parties were named for the territory that they controlled, with the Street House holding the ground level of Morgantown, while the Roof House held dominion on the monorail track and many of the rooftops of the city. This was all documented by Alicia Parker, valedictorian of the last graduating class of VTU, who observed the changes from a rooftop campsite. As she recorded the unfolding history for posterity, she had a minor amount of contact with an astronomy student, Victor, who had made his own solitary rooftop camp across the street. Alicia watched as the rivalry between the two houses escalated into an all-out war. Though the radiation levels in Morgantown had dropped below instant mortality, they were still too high for safe, long-term habitation. This meant that the students had been taking radiation medication since they had emerged from sheltering through the nuclear winter. As the supply of these medications ran down, the competition for them grew more fierce. When a fight for these drugs in a pharmacy resulted in a killing, the house war began. The house war was a brutal conflict for survival. The Street House besieged the Roof House at their headquarters atop the pharmacy across from VTU. They believed that as they controlled the streets and the lower levels of the town, they had control over the vast majority of the supplies and they could simply wait for the Roof House to submit or starve. What they didn't know was that the Roof House was raiding their supplies nightly by slipping into the upper windows of their safe houses and absconding with their food and meds. Infuriated by the Roof House dropping empty food boxes down on them, the Street House attempted to storm their rooftop, climbing the fire escape. Before they could reach the top, they were immolated by the defenders. Though we don't know the exact outcome of this war, I believe that eventually the meds ran out, and that the Roof House was forced to abandon their rooftops, only to be burned alive in revenge by the Street House. As for the remains of the Street House, I believe that either they stayed and died of radiation poisoning or became ghouls, or they abandoned Morgantown and found a less radioactive place to live. Over the next few years, Morgantown was a mostly abandoned ruin, with little activity aside from a rising population of feral ghouls. The situation under the city was a different matter. In the years before the bombs, though the Americans had been making good progress in the ground war in China and had superior technology in many fields, the Chinese were doing a far better job in the field of espionage. They installed spies across the country, hiding these operatives in front businesses. One of these fronts was Mama Dolce's, a food processor with operations set up in Morgantown and Washington, D.C. at the very least. At Mama Dolce's in Morgantown, the plant on the surface covered the entrance to a large subterranean intelligence and research base, the Fujinia Intelligence Base. In the years before the war, the staff was working on two projects: Liberator robots and stealth suits. Liberator bots are small green robots with 4 spindly legs that carry them into battle as they fire lasers, spin blades, and scream Chinese slogans to demoralize the enemy. The stealth suits are high-tech outfits that the Chinese used to great effect in special operations to grant their operatives what amounts to invisibility. In Morgantown, while they had worked hard to improve the Liberator bots, the researchers really didn't have the equipment required to provide improvements to the suits. As it turns out, even these missions were fronts for the staff, as the base was really established for an even more secret reason. The Chinese had heard rumblings of massive, automated, rearmable nuclear missile silos in Appalachia. The Fujinia base was there to learn as much as they could about this potential threat. In the end, the Americans somehow managed to keep the secret of these silos from slipping out any further, and a local Chinese intelligence agent recommended that they change their priority to attempting to steal the technology that made Watoga the city of the future. Unfortunately for the Chinese spies and researchers at the Fujinia base, their presence was known to the Americans, and they were subject to an attack by the Enclave operative known as Agent Gray. Gray assaulted the site in order to release the Liberator robots from the base. He hoped that this action would move the automated DEFCON system towards 1. If you're interested in that story, I suggest you watch my video on the White Spring Enclave. As for how this affected Morgantown, the Mama Dolce plant now swarmed with Liberator robots that were expelled from the false chimney. After Agent Gray's assault, the city of Morgantown again lay abandoned until the closing days of 2082, when refugees from Charleston began to flow in. These refugees were fleeing the devastation that took place in the Christmas flood. In the early morning hours of Christmas Day 2082, Raider boss David Thorpe destroyed the Summersville Lake Dam, drowning thousands of the residents and destroying most of the structures of Charleston. The responders had their headquarters in Charleston. Those that survived the flood fled north and worked to establish a new headquarters at the Morgantown airport. It took the responders nearly 4 years to properly rebuild their forces, but they did so in the terminal and on the tarmac of the airport. Though the responders did establish some safe houses in Morgantown proper, the city remained dangerously infested with feral ghouls, so for the most part they left it abandoned. Not too long after they moved in, Morgantown received some new neighbors to the north. Knights of the newly formed Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel arrived at Grafton Dam. Grant McNamara, their chief scribe, quickly restored the dam to service, and the Brotherhood provided protection to the cross-mountain trade routes that ran over the Savage Divide to the rebuilt Harper's Ferry to the east. Around late 2085, Morgantown received far less savory neighbors in the form of the Gourmands Raider Gang. These cannibal raiders came out of the mountains to protect their food supply from the super mutants that had begun to range out from the West Tech facility in Huntersville. Their new home at the Bolton Greens Country Club sat on the edge of one of the cross-mountain caravan routes where they were ready to consume the traders that passed. In 2086, the now fully rebuilt Responders of Morgantown, in conjunction with the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel, coordinated an assault on the super mutants of Huntersville, and they were victorious. It wasn't long after this that the city of Harper's Ferry was wiped off the map. Though they didn't know it at the time, the destruction of the city was likely an indirect result of the success of the assault on Huntersville. I've told the story of the attack on Huntersville and the subsequent fall of Harper's Ferry in my videos on the Enclave, the Free States, and Harper's Ferry. It will suffice to say, for the purpose of covering Morgantown specifically, that in 2086 a mass of monsters were released east of the mountains of the Savage Divide. These monstrous bats carried a deadly and highly communicable disease known as the Scorched Plague. This plague transformed those infected into the servants of the Scorched Beasts. Together, the Scorched Beasts and their infected servants, known as the Scorched, wiped Harper's Ferry from the map. Shortly after this, they were engaged by the Brotherhood of Steel, who, for the most part, contained them in a decade-long struggle for survival. When Harper's Ferry fell, the cross-mountain trade effectively died. With a lack of traders crossing the Savage Divide, the gourmands at the Bolton Greens ran out of prey, and they are said to have eaten themselves to death. As the Brotherhood of Steel faced down the apocalyptic threat of the Scorched Beasts, they pressured the responders at Morgantown hard for supplies to fight. Over time, these insistent and heavy demands strained the relationship between the responders and the Brotherhood until there was a simmering animosity. In the early 2090s, agents of the Brotherhood of Steel snuck into Vault-Tec University with the hopes of using their labs to sequence the DNA of the Scorched Beasts that were killing them. Because of the animosity between the responders and the Brotherhood, they unfortunately didn't work together on this project to find weaknesses in their enemy. The two Brotherhood operatives were overwhelmed by the mass of feral ghouls within the school and were killed before they could perform the necessary experiment, much less transmit the results back to the Brotherhood. In August 2095, the Brotherhood of Steel fell, and the Scorched Beast threat began to flood over the Savage Divide. By the next year, Morgantown was on the front line of the fight with the Scorched Beasts and their Scorched minions. In November 2096, the responders had their last stand within the terminal of the Morgantown airport, and as the last of them fell, the uninfected human population of Appalachia was crawling into its grave. By the next year, the last of the raiders of the Savage Divide had fled, died, or been turned to the Scorched. For the next 5 years, Appalachia was a graveyard, with the growling Scorched serving as a bleak reminder of the frailty of the post-war civilization. The first uninfected human to walk the streets of Morgantown again would be a vault dweller, Ruben Gill, the overseer of Vault 51. Gill, who arrived in Morgantown on October 23, 2102, was the sole survivor of Vault 51, along with being the vault's overseer. If you're interested in the full story of Vault 51, I recommend you check out my video on that topic. Regardless, Gill had smuggled himself out of Vault 51 and crash-landed on the streets of Morgantown. He quickly left the city and began to make his way over to Vault 76. Amazingly, he didn't cross paths with the overseer of Vault 76, who was on her way to Morgantown at the same time, having left her vault late the previous night. She arrived searching for any remnant of the responders, and she used the opportunity to visit her old high school and college before moving on towards Charleston. The other dwellers of Vault 76 soon followed her tracks to Morgantown before following her on. Over the course of the coming months, the dwellers managed to solve the problem of the Scorched Beast threat, and people began to return to Appalachia. Scavengers have returned to Morgantown and can be seen working on homes or looting them for resources. Along with this, Gilbert Hobson, a former resident of the state of Connecticut, arrived at VTU in 2103. He came to visit the school on his tour of the intact former centers of higher education in the United States, and he seems to enjoy VTU as he's stuck around for over a year now. He lost his wife to cancer not long after the bombs, and he enjoys having conversations with other travelers. Alright, that pretty much covers the history of Morgantown in the Fallout universe, so let's look at the real-world history of the city. I've covered the general geological history of West Virginia before, so let's move on to the native history of the area around Morgantown. The earliest arrival of Paleo Indians seems to date back to about 11,000 BC. There's little known about these peoples, but they appear to have been nomadic, settling temporarily on the banks of the rivers. As the world left the last ice age, the terrain changed from tundra to forests. This new vegetation brought game to the area. These new natives started to settle more permanent settlements around 1000 BC. I've had some trouble determining what native peoples lived here in the woodland period, but it seems that the Hopewell culture may have been present. More recently, people of the Monunga culture appear to have settled in the region in a period that lasted from around 1050 to 1635. The Monunga people farmed corn and lived in small villages in the Monongahela River Valley. They traded with their neighbors and eventually European explorers and trappers. It seems possible that contact with the latter and the diseases that they brought may have been the cause for their decline. By the time the first European settlers arrived in what we now know as West Virginia, the land was claimed by both the Shawnee and the Iroquois. As I've stated before, the Iroquois signed the land over to the English, while the Shawnee did not. This led to conflict between the arriving colonists and the Shawnee, who used the land as a hunting ground. Let's now consider those first European settlers. The origins of Morgantown are tied to the history of the family that founded it. The story of this particular branch of the Morgan family begins with Morgan Morgan, likely born November 1st, 1688 in Glamorganshire, Wales. Much of the story of Morgan Morgan appears to be lost, but it's believed that he immigrated to the colony of Delaware sometime around 1712 or 1713, arriving with an education from Cambridge and some money. He set up as a merchant in northern Delaware, married Catherine Garretson, and they began a family together. After building a business and a family, the Morgans moved to a 1,000-acre property they'd been granted in what is now the Panhandle of West Virginia. Arriving in 1731, they were some of the first European settlers in what is now West Virginia. In 1735, Zackwell Morgan was born in modern Berkeley County, West Virginia. Zackwell and his brother David Morgan were part of the failed Braddock Expedition of 1755 and the Forbes Expedition of 1758 during the French and Indian War. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and all rights to the land on which Morgantown now sits were ceded by the French. Zackwell and David moved to create a new settlement in what is now Monongalia County. I've seen this dated to both 1766 and 1771, but the accounts agree that Zackwell was the first long-term resident of the future site of Morgantown, at least the first of European ancestry. David and Zackwell built Fort Morgan on the site in 1772 to protect against raids by the natives. When the Revolutionary War began, Zackwell and David both joined the American cause and served with distinction throughout the conflict. In another case where I can't determine the exact truth of the circumstances, it appears that Zackwell had his claim to the area granted by the Virginia General Assembly in 1781, and that it was surveyed by Nicholas Decker. I've also seen a claim that Decker was the one who founded the first settlement on the site, but I've also seen it claimed that William Haymond surveyed the area. I don't know what's true of these claims, but it should be noted that Morgantown sits on the Monongahela at Decker Creek. In history that is agreed upon, Zackwell opened the town's first tavern in 1783, and the county seat of Monongalia moved to the town the same year. In 1784, George Washington visited the area, and he and Zackwell discussed potential sites for future roads through the area. Michael Kern built a non-denominational church in the area in the early 1780s. In 1785, Morgantown was chartered by the Virginia General Assembly. Due to conflicts with the natives in the region, the town took a while to get off the ground, but Zackwell stayed there until his death on New Year's Day, 1795. He was buried in a cemetery at Prickett's Fort, and he's been honored with a statue in Morgantown since 2016. I got this street view shot of the statue, and I'm sure that Zackwell would be honored that Google is protecting his identity by blurring out his face. Back to Morgantown itself, though. In 1803, the first school was established. The first steamboat arrived in 1826, and river traffic began to grow. In 1838, Morgantown was incorporated into a city with a population of 650. In 1861, both of the representatives of Monongalia County voted against secession in the Virginia Secession Convention. When Virginia did secede, Monongalia was one of the original counties to send delegates to the Wheeling Convention to establish the restored government of Virginia. The Civil War never seems to have come directly to Morgantown, but that's not to say that it didn't come close. 53 miles southeast of Morgantown, the all-important B&O Railroad crossed the Cheat River at Rollsburg. On Sunday, April 26, 1863, the local garrison of 250 Union troops and citizens of Rollsburg were alerted to the fact that a large force of Confederate raiders were closing in. Rollsburg citizen Peter Watring used his oxen to haul Union cannons to the top of what is now known as Cannon Hill, and together the soldiers and the citizenry held off General Jones and his 2,000 Confederate soldiers intent on destroying the bridges over the Cheat. Unable to advance, Jones retreated and moved on to Fairmont. And a neat bit of connectivity, I talked about that raid on Fairmont in my video on Monunga. A few weeks later, on June 20th, 1863, Monongalia and the other counties in western Virginia formed the new state of West Virginia. In 1867, West Virginia's legislature established the West Virginia Agricultural College in Morgantown. The school received a name change in 1868 to become West Virginia University. Having been founded as an agricultural school, WVU still has experimental farms, and I can't help but wonder if the Vaultec Agricultural Research Center is an in-game representation of this. There were two public schools built in Morgantown in 1868. Sadly, as post-Civil War segregation was beginning to rear its head, one of these schools was for whites and one was for blacks. Along with this, many neighborhoods held deed restrictions that banned blacks and occasionally immigrants and Jews from owning property. While it took years for this discrimination to end, thankfully clauses like this are no longer legal. In 1886, a branch of the B&O Railroad reached north into Morgantown, spurring new growth in the city. The discovery of oil, gas, and coal in the area drove rapid industrial development at the end of the 19th into the early 20th centuries. Just like Clarksburg, Morgantown also received an influx of skilled Western European glassworkers. Metalworkers from Hungary and Greece and Welsh immigrants arrived as well. In 1901, Morgantown annexed Greenmont, Seneca, and South Morgantown, causing a dramatic population spike from under 1,900 in 1900 to over 9,100 in 1910. Morgantown High School was built in 1924 in South Park across Decker Creek to the south of Morgantown Center. The population of Morgantown grew consistently, rising to 25,525 by the 1950 census. While the population fell again in the 1960s, it rose again to 29,431 for the 1970 census. In the 1960s and 70s, WVU grew, adding new campuses in Morgantown. In 1975, the Morgantown Personal Rapid Transit System opened, with its 3 stations linking the WVU campuses together. The PRT was expanded to its current 5 stations by 1978. The population shrank to a modern low of 25,879 in time for the 1990 census, but it has grown consistently since then, reaching an estimated all-time high of 30,347 in 2020. Today, Morgantown is a beautiful city with a historic downtown, great restaurants, sporting events, and scenic surroundings. Alright, that's all I have to say about real-world Morgantown, but I do have some notes on this content before closing things out. I want to open this section by stating that this is a remake of my second lore video released back in September 2019. At the time, I thought I had a much better understanding of the overall timeline than I did, so I slipped in a few inaccuracies, such as the Brotherhood of Steel falling before Harper's Ferry. These inaccuracies have bothered me since I realized my mistakes, but I decided to hold off on fixing them until I produced more lore videos in Fallout 76, rather than simply reproducing my original videos. That said, this is a complete remake, utilizing 100% new footage, as my original footage was lost in an external hard drive failure a couple years ago. Along with this, my original script doesn't hold up to my current standards, so I rewrote it almost entirely. With that said, you probably noticed that I don't talk much about the events related to the responders. This was purposeful, as I want to cover them separately. We'll do so very soon in What Happened to the Responders Part 1, covering the time from the war to their extinction in November 2096. Part 2 will cover the new responders that will soon be coming to the White Spring Resort. Expect Part 1 sometime in August, but I've got several personal issues to take care of next month, so it might come slightly later. With those first two things relating more to the nature of this video, let's move on to some of the little stories and issues that didn't quite fit into the overall narrative. First, Morgantown was home to a free climbing poet who left a note behind on their last climb. It reads, "Come here all day, hide from the noise. Watch from here, little joys. Only climb, stealing time. Hide away, no time to pray. I feel wind, I see birds, brain won't mend, just write words. Want to jump, I get scared, just sit each time, I like to rhyme." Second, there was a family in Morgantown that was either extremely lazy or very festive. I say that as there's a house with Christmas lights and a Christmas tree when the world ended in late October. So either their decorations were still up from the previous year, or they were so excited to celebrate that they put the decorations up over 2 months early. Third, we learned from a record here in Morgantown that the Fallout universe had human resources departments. In the upper floors of a partially ruined office building, there is a record of a series of HR meetings discussing complaints made by 2 female employees, Susan Godwin from sales and Allison Perkins from accounting, against a male superior, Director Franklin Henderson. The exact nature of these complaints and the outcome of these meetings is unknown, but I thought it was still interesting that this record exists. Fourth, there was a crazy cat person that once lived on the outskirts of Morgantown. A farm owned by Jay Schramm, almost certainly a reference to former Bethesda level designer Justin Schramm, is host to numerous cat traps, cat food bowls, cat pictures, and disturbingly 16 mounted cat heads. The reasoning behind the strange proclivities of the previous owner may remain a mystery forever. On this farm, there's also an old Quonset hut-style barn that is host to a handful of petrified corpses. How they ended up here remains a mystery, but the marginally locked doors might point to a purposeful confinement. Fifth, there's a White Spring Resort bus on Route 64 at the southwestern edge of Morgantown. Inside there are a few skeletons with their luggage. The exact nature of their voyage isn't apparent, but I think they may have been on their way home from the White Spring when the bombs came down. Sixth, Victor, the astronomer that built a camp on the rooftop, had a neon sign that said "Among the Stars." While this is definitely on brand for him, I don't know where in Morgantown he would have gotten this sign, nor does it make sense for him to have salvaged it in the midst of all the chaos and violence when he didn't feel safe leaving the rooftop. Seventh, the Portside Pub was serving strangely cheap shrimp. On the happy hour menu, they have a handful of items that appeared at the properly inflated prices one might find in 2070s America. But there's one item that is far off that mark. That is the pound of peel and eat shrimp that can be bought for $1 a pound. In a world where a large coffee and a jelly donut went for $30, how can they possibly have sold shrimp for so little? This may have been a mistake by the devs, or the Portside Pub was really undercharging, or possibly selling something other than shrimp as shrimp. Eighth, another questionable business strategy can be found at one of the town's bars. This bar has a sign stating, "The first drink is free." Now, this could be a simplified way of saying buy one get one free, or buy a bunch of drinks and the first one is free, but the sign doesn't say that. Taken at face value, I can imagine how a college crowd would have put this place out of business quickly. Ninth, I mentioned the story of Chief Mayfield in the main narrative, but I didn't tell you that from what I've found, there's some cut content related to him as well. Specifically, a note titled Public Notice, Martial Law. The note stated, quote, "By order of Chief Mayfield, a state of martial law is now in effect. Per Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution, habeas corpus is suspended, and summary judgment will be dispensed against those found in violation of the law. Additionally, a curfew of 9 p.m. is now in place. Anyone found outdoors during curfew will be jailed," unquote. It's odd to me that this was cut when the terminal entry referencing it was not. 10th, the name of the Chinese intelligence base, Fujinia, means Virginia in Chinese, at least according to Google Translate. 11th, because of its proximity to Morgantown in-game, Grafton Lake may be a representation of two real-world lakes, Taggart Lake and Cheat Lake. The name in-game places it near Grafton, like the real-world Taggart Lake. Cheat Lake sits a few miles east of Morgantown and is not upriver of the city, but given how close it is in-game, it could be an approximation of both real-world lakes. There are a few rivers in-game that represent two or more real-world rivers, e.g. the Shenandoah Greenbrier River. 12th, there was a gentleman by the name of Trevor Moorman who lived at the top of the Shadowbreeze Apartments. Mr. Moorman was in the possession of some very high-tech paraphernalia, specifically alien blaster rounds, and the plans to convert an alien blaster to use microfusion cells. This can be ascertained due to the fact that he had a code that gave him access to the key to TNT Dome 2 at the Black Mountain Ordnance Works. I covered that content in my video on obtaining the alien blaster. Lastly, I mentioned back in 2019 that as Morgantown lies less than 60 miles south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that the pit might make an appearance at some point in the future, and it looks like I was right. We should be able to visit the pit in expeditions planned this fall. Alright, I think that should do it for the story of Morgantown. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. I've been streaming on YouTube lately. I currently am streaming Tuesday and Thursday evenings and Saturday afternoons when I have the time, so if you're interested, come by and check it out. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios, Brian, and Real76 for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.